You've joined us tonight for How to Think Like Shakespeare. I'm joined by Scott Newstock, who's a professor of English and the director of the Pierce Shakespeare Endowment at Rhodes College. Scott, I think you're with me in Memphis. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Scott, I want to thank you for joining us. I also want to thank Maureen Lamb, who is our TA tonight. Maureen is one of our Teacher Advisory Council members, and she has not only added some resources to the library that correspond with tonight's session, but she'll be in the chat box sharing those links and sort of keeping the conversation moving in that instruction piece. But we're really here to learn more about your work and the work that you've published recently and the work you do with educators around the country. And before I turn over the PowerPoint to you, I hope you don't mind, I'd like to ask you just a starting question. And I'd like you to reflect a little bit on your own work at Rhodes and the students that you work with. Scott, when those kids come to your class, many of whom were in our participants' classes a year, 2 years, 3 years before, what do they seem to struggle with the most in terms of their thinking? What do you see in terms of the college undergrad in 2020? Where are their obstacles?
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, I think in some ways the obstacles are the same as they've always been.
Yeah.
Part of what I'm always trying to do in making that transition from secondary teaching and reading and writing and thinking to a post-secondary level is to just help them build on the great foundation that they've had and then take a leap into kind of more subtle and more abstract work that's going to be demanded of them at the collegiate level. So I just finished the semester teaching first year writing, and it's exciting to do that in the first semester because they've come an enormous distance in the 3 months that I've been working with them. So I mean, partly it's just developmental that they're becoming more adult thinkers. I think I'm with many of you are probably familiar with a book by John Warner that argues against the 5-paragraph essay, and I think one of the things I often am trying to do is help them think about forms of writing that get beyond that template, which is a helpful template to start with, but it can be limiting if that's their only template in how they write their essays.
Yeah, it's a fantastic answer, and being able to connect those dots from the K-12 level, likely the secondary level, to you in the college classroom is, I think, part of the value of these kinds of sessions. So again, we're looking forward to hearing more from you about your work as an author, as a writer, and as an educator. And I'll be bringing questions from our audience as we move forward.
Great. Thank you, Andy. I'm pleased to join everyone tonight from afar. This is actually kind of a homecoming for me because one of the most delightful weeks I ever spent discussing Shakespeare was at the National Humanities Center that took place back in 2013 under the leadership of Sarah Beckwith. I was with another dozen Shakespeare scholars, and we discussed just one play, The Winter's Tale, for that week. And it was just remarkable, the conversations that we had, and I'm grateful for the chance to discuss Shakespeare again with the National Humanities Center, if remotely. This evening, I'd like to just sketch an outline of How to Think Like Shakespeare. It's a brief book, but in a way, it's also kind of a long book in the sense that each of its 14 chapters seeks to weave together dozens of different voices gathered across different nations and centuries and offer suggestions for further reading. So in that spirit, I hope that this webinar also feels like it might lead you to different pathways for further thought. So in the book, I basically set out some of the educational assumptions that shaped Shakespeare's career and tried to reflect upon how those assumptions are sometimes at odds with our own assumptions. We might think of that type of education as being very backwards and very oppressive and unyielding, but we also know that it's an educational system that produced many great minds and created world-shifting insights in fields ranging from calculus to physiology to global economic theory and even the philosophy of consciousness itself. So I'd like to try to think that there's still things we can sustain from that form of education today and help enrich our students' learning at this moment. So Andy asked me to kind of describe the genesis of the book, which I'm really happy to do. I like to think of it as growing out of two converging paths in my life. One is I'm a teacher of Shakespeare, and I'm lucky to teach at Rhodes College, where we have a fund devoted to Shakespeare studies. So over the last decade, I've been reading a lot of fantastic scholarship about the kind of intellectual and social and material conditions that helped permit a mind like Shakespeare's to flourish, as well as those of his peers and contemporaries in 16th, 17th century England. So that ranges from everything from his childhood schooling to the profoundly collaborative nature of the early modern theater. Now, when my students first write their first papers about Shakespeare, this happens every semester. They're writing about him as a playwright, and they often spell playwright P-L-A-Y-W-R-I-T-E. And that makes sense because it sounds like what a playwright does. It's someone who writes, W-R-I-T-E-S. But interestingly, the word playwright is actually spelled P-L-A-Y-W-R-I-G-H-T. And that goes from an old English word that basically means a workman or an artificer. There are ark rights and battle rights and boat rights and bread rights, butter rights, candle rights, you name it. A playwright is someone who crafts plays. They're wrought, they're made, they're designed, they're fabricated. And I love that sense of right as a maker. And that to me is become a central conceit in the way I talk about Shakespeare and think about Shakespeare and teach Shakespeare and discuss Shakespeare, is thinking of his work as a process of making rather than something that's very distant from us. And I think that I'd like to think that helps students feel closer to that figure as someone who is a human being rather than a distant monument in some way. So I've been reading a lot of that great scholarship about playmaking, or thinking of writing as a form of craft, or thinking as a form of craft. During the same decade, my own kids have been progressing through elementary and secondary school, and Memphis really has been an epicenter for educational reforms, some of which have been helpful, some of which have been less helpful and controversial. Memphis was I think it was the only city that both got Race to the Top money and Gates Foundation money. So what was very optimistically projected a decade ago to improve education in Memphis has, in some cases, not been as successful as it was hoped to be initially. And so that's something that animated my own thinking as well. But my kids were going through primary and secondary school, and I was frustrated by some of the reforms I was seeing, and I was struggling to think about why it didn't seem to align with what I valued about education from the Shakespearean perspective. So we also, of course, many of you know that Shakespeare has an anomalous status in the Common Core as being really the only named author in the Common Core. That's an anomaly, and that's a strange status to have no other named authors and have one named author. You either should name many figures or you should name none. It's a topic that my friend Ayanna Thompson has addressed in her book, Teaching Shakespeare with Purpose. I highly recommend this book to everyone that's listening here tonight. It's incredibly practical and offers concrete suggestions about teaching Shakespeare in light of the Common Core standards requirement of teaching Shakespeare. But I was still kind of struggling and frustrated with these educational pedagogies that my kids were encountering, and I was trying to find ways to articulate why I found them frustrating. One reason was that they often felt very fragmentary to me, that they didn't seem to accord with the wonderful dynamics of reading and writing and thinking that I love and that I love seeing in my own students. And it felt like a lot of the patterns that we were seeing in education were too fragmentary and not holistic. So I kind of found myself puzzling over the figure of Shakespeare and if there were ways that I could draw attention to some of the enduring practices that help shape him. So I'm offering Shakespeare not as someone who is a model to reproduce slavishly, but rather as a kind of mirror to reflect upon. And in this, I'm kind of doing with what one of Shakespeare's predecessors said, which was, if you want to look at someone as a model, you don't actually want to imitate them directly. You want to imitate aspects of them, or you want to emulate aspects of them, but not to kind of reproduce them in an apish manner. So Erasmus has this great line that it can happen that someone who is most Ciceronian, who is most unlike Cicero, that they've kind of captured the spirit of Cicero, not by directly imitating, but by capturing something more abstract than that direct imitation. And I think that's what Emerson is getting at in his self-reliance essay when he says, Shakespeare will never be made by the study of Shakespeare. So the object of the book is not to reproduce Shakespeare, but rather to use Shakespeare as a kind of inspiration for thinking about our own education. So I have 14 chapters in the book. They're all very brief, but they're packed with lots of quotations that are meant to inspire thinking. I'm not talking about what Shakespeare purportedly thought, but really how he thought. And my main suggestion is that if you want to think like Shakespeare, you really just need to reconsider the kinds of habits, institutional habits that helped shape his mind. And that includes practices as, deceptively simple as transcribing quotations in a notebook or engaging with previous authors. This system of education was deeply steeped in rhetoric. It was designed for creating people who could speak well and write well in unforeseen circumstances. And in a way, rhetoric was nothing less than the fabric of thought for Shakespeare's era. It wasn't just part of the curriculum, it was the backbone of the curriculum. So, in my frustration with my kids' education, as I was feeling like they were overwhelmed with assessment and kind of educational pedagogies where there was teaching to the test and it kind of tail wagging the dog dynamics, I was struggling to find a language or a lexicon or a vocabulary that would better describe what I think writing entails and what I think thinking entails. So for me, I think it's more helpful to think about thinking as well as thinking about writing and reading and speaking as a kind of a craft. That's a kind of a power or force that's developed in conversation with other people that are practitioners, and it's something that is not arbitrary and external to you, but it's something that you're working on over time. In fact, you work on it over a lifetime. I also talk about the dynamics of fit. What does it mean to say that we fit our writing to an occasion or we fit our writing to an audience? We all recognize what misfit is. This is a great woodcut from the 17th century of a guy with boots on his hands, and he's got gloves on his feet, and he's wearing his shirt on his legs, and he's wearing his pants on his arms. And so it's clear that there's a kind of sense of misfit there. And one of the things I was trying to articulate in that chapter, that brief chapter, was just thinking through what do we mean when we say something fits well, or that's a fitting statement, or that's a well-crafted statement. In the fourth chapter, I turned to the idea of place, which in some ways is very odd to be talking about right now because we're all in our distributed places all over the globe, and many of us are teaching remotely. But I do think that one thing that the global pandemic has really forced us to recognize is that there are many virtues to being in a room together with other human beings. I know that everyone has been immensely creative in their teaching, in trying to adapt to online fora, and students and teachers and parents alike have been incredibly flexible about trying to discover new ways to interact in remote circumstances. But I think the pandemic has actually helped us recognize those wonderful qualities of being in a room together and being able to make eye contact with someone and being able to recognize body language and being able to kind of sense the pace of how things should be going in a room. So I talk in that chapter just briefly on the virtues, the wonderful power that place can have for human interaction. I think we all agree that attention has been something that has been stressed in remote teaching circumstances. I know I've been struggling, and not always successfully, to sustain the attention of my classes and myself to sustain my attention when I'm staring at a screen all day long. And I cite a number of educators and thinkers in this chapter who just make the very old-fashioned insight statement that attention is really at the heart of education, and that all kinds of intellectual and religious and cultural traditions have devoted enormous energy to cultivating habits of attention. I talked briefly about technology, not as an anti-technology stance, but rather just trying to expand our sense of what technology really entails, which includes things like books and handwriting and pieces of paper, and again, being in a room together around a table. I want to kind of offer a more expansive sense of what technology is, not to be against digital technology, but just to remind ourselves of the full range of human interaction that is supported by kind of strategies of shaping our connection with each other. In the chapter on imitation, I point out that Shakespeare himself was an imitator of his peers and his predecessors, and that many other writers for the 400 centuries since his lifetime have imitated him and emulated him and responded to him in all kinds of wonderful ways. And just pointing out that imitation is and remains a fundamental feature of human development. It's something that we certainly recognize in infants, and we appreciate it in physical development on all kinds of levels of watching a child imitate a sports figure that they admire. And I think that carries over, of course, to intellectual practices as well. That one thing that we all want to do for our students is give them good models to imitate in our own habits and our own intellectual behavior and our own habits of mind that we're hoping to inspire them to if not imitate directly, at least consider and recognize as being kind of possible pathways for being a thinker in the world. This period was a period that was characterized in its pedagogy by doing all kinds of interesting exercises in the classroom, where you would, in effect, find ways of saying the same thing in different manners. And I'll go into detail about one of those in just a few minutes here. But just reminding ourselves again that we fully recognize that exercise is a crucial aspect of physical development in terms of improving our physical fitness or our physical performance, and that exercises are, in the best sense, ways of stretching our mind and stretching our writing and stretching our reading on less physical and more kind of artistic or cultural development. Shakespeare's era was an era that was had education that was suffused by conversation, where all kinds of exercises were devoted to getting students to converse with each other, to converse with past models, to perform plays in the classroom, to write an essay where they would argue one position and then they would be forced to argue the other side of the same position. So it really was an education that was suffused with all kinds of conversation, both on the page and in verbal performance in the classroom. So even when if you think about the most famous soliloquy from Hamlet, the to be or not to be soliloquy, it really is a form of conversation with himself. It derives from a classroom practice of saying, argue on both sides of a question. Is it better to live, or is it better to choose to commit suicide when things are not going well in the world and you feel oppressed? And if you look at the speech in light of that kind of either or choice, you can see how it derives from that classroom practice of saying, argue on this side of the question and then argue on the opposite side of the question in order to attempt to refine a more sophisticated, more subtle answer, more nuanced response by the time you get to the end of that either or dynamic. It was an era that I think had a wonderful sense of absorbing aspects of the past and making them newly available for the present. There's a character in Willa Cather's novel, Death Comes for the Archbishop, who makes a statement that I really love. This character in Cather's novel says, "A soup like this is not the work of one person. It's the result of a constantly refined tradition. There are nearly 1,000 years of history in this soup." So there's that sense of common stock, which was long considered a communal property, something from which you have a right to draw, as well as more aspirationally stock as something to which you could contribute. So it's not a static thing. It's a growing and a living and evolving thing, but it creates a continuity between the past and the present. And I think that's something that was characteristic of education in 16th century England. The chapter on constraint is asking us just to think about ways in which constraint actually can enable creativity, and we have many examples of kind of popular culture instances where we're given arbitrary constraints, like let's say in a cooking show, where you're given a handful of ingredients and a handful of tools and a set amount of time, and within that time, with those ingredients and with those tools, go for it and see what you can do with those set of constraints. I think that's not dissimilar to working within the constraint of, when we're assigning our students an arbitrary length of an essay. My students right now are working on a small 500-word footnote, and some of them have been asking, can it be 700 words? And others are asking, can it be 300 words? And, part of me wants to be flexible and encourage them to do whatever works for them. At the same time, part of the task is to just see how well you can do writing a 500-word essay, which is different than a 700-word or a 300-word essay. And there, again, I think if you make the physical analog to a sports competition, I think that really helps them apprehend why constraints are productive. So I say, if you were to run a 400-meter dash and someone else decided that they were going to stop at 300 meters, you would say that you weren't really running the 400-meter dash. You weren't playing within the constraints. So that chapter focuses in particular on the sonnet form as a particularly constrained genre of 14 lines with a set of rules about how it's rhymed and how many syllables are in each line. But I see that as a model, or I take that as a model for the wonderful, wonderful variety that can come out of that arbitrary 14-line unit. Hundreds of years of writers from across the globe have found that a wonderful, productive constraint to work within. So as I noted already at the beginning, I like to think of Shakespeare as a maker. So the second to last chapter really pushes that notion as hard as I can push it, connecting that sense of making to a long-standing sense of creation, and the ideal that when you're presenting writers that you're reading, that you're helping inspire students to think about themselves as makers, that they are participating in and contributing to an ongoing process of creation in their verbal artifacts. And then I conclude with the chapter on freedom, in part, which largely focuses on a fantastic essay by James Baldwin that has the very provocative title, "Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare." This is an essay that you can find easily online at the Folger Shakespeare Library. Baldwin, like a lot of intellectuals and celebrities in 1964, for the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's birth, was asked to write an essay about Shakespeare. So he writes this powerful, characteristically, typically powerful autobiographical essay with that title, "Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare." So already with the title, you start to wonder where he's going with this, and you ask yourself, why did he hate Shakespeare? And then, well, what made him stop, and what's his relationship to Shakespeare now? It's a marvelous essay, and it really captures the spirit of what I'm trying to do in the book, which is, present Shakespeare as a peer, as a living figure with whom you can be in dialogue, and a figure who can animate our thinking in the present and can be a kind of not a distant dead thing, but a living voice with whom we are interacting and conversing today. So Baldwin describes how at first he kind of sought freedom from having to read Shakespeare, that he resented the feeling that he needed to read anything other than contemporary works. Yet he eventually came to relish the freedom to make Shakespeare his own. And in doing so, I think Baldwin really achieved a mutual recognition in Shakespeare that few of us ever reach, an inner freedom which cannot be attained in any other way than by inhabiting other minds through art. So that's the quick overview of the book. Andy, I can take a pause there if you want, or I can go into a couple of examples of pedagogical things that were active in Shakespeare's lifetime and that I've tried to revive in my own classroom.
Scott, thanks for that overview. And in particular, I really appreciate the way you connected that to your own practice in the classroom and your own experience as an educator. I'm curious, just as a quick question before you move on, Shakespeare clearly is the vehicle or the inspiration for this work. Would you say that other writers of any era have similar kinds of themes that you could pull out, or is Shakespeare just the absolute best example?
Oh no, once you look at the book, you see it's stuffed with literally hundreds of other writers and thinkers from different eras and different nations and different traditions. So my training is as a Shakespeare scholar, and I am the Shakespeare professor at Rhodes College, and so in some ways that's my platform. but I'm using that figure as I hope a kind of pathway into a wonderful series of practices that endure across nations and across eras and across traditions. So Shakespeare's kind of the hook, but it is in no way a book that's obsessed with that as the only figure by any stretch of the imagination. Again, like I said about the Common Core, I think it's troubling when that figure becomes for a figure of fixation. So it's kind of a two-step. Like I'm trying to draw the reader in with the figure of Shakespeare, but then I'm immediately trying to point to a whole host of other figures that have similar practices within their thinking and their writing.
Thank you for saying that. And I wanted that point made partly because there are likely participants tonight who don't literally teach Shakespeare, and I want all of those participants to understand that this is a conversation that you can apply to the grade, to the content, to the curriculum that you teach, whether it's in elementary school, as some of you are, or a college educator like Mary. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear to everybody as you do this deep dive now. Thank you.
Sure. So, again, I have the kind of governing conceit of thinking as something more like a craft rather than, I don't know, a checklist that you have to complete in order to fulfill some requirements to get a grade. So one way that I do that is just point out that a lot of the great ways that thinking is described even in Shakespeare's plays is by talking about it as something like a craft, whether that's thought's world like a potter's wheel, or the quick forge and working house of thought, or even a character hammering out their thoughts, which happens a couple of times across the plays. There's even a word that Shakespeare invents, which is that word forgative or forgative. It looks almost like it's supposed to mean forget, but it actually does relate to a forge, like you're hammering out thoughts on a forge. So here's just one example of what I think is something that's still useful today. It's something I'm sure many of you do in your own classrooms, but it's kind of a fun way to think through how this worked in Shakespeare's era and how it can still be helpful in our era. So I don't know, Andy, if you recognize this speech or not, or if you had a chance to glance at this yet. It's a little confusing because the character in this image has a different name than the character that we usually think of him being. He's who we know as Polonius. So this is that goodbye speech that Polonius gives to his son Laertes, which is stuffed with the famous goodbye of to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. So the question is why, this is from the 1603 first printing of the play, the first quarto of the play. Why are these little quotation marks in the margin here? It's a kind of an odd typographical thing. We think it's probably because it's a signal to a reader to write these down in your notebook. This is kind of like, there are many moments when I'm teaching where I'll say like, this is important, you should be writing this down. I might want to have this on paper for later consideration or later recollection. So this is part of this practice of commonplacing, where basically students were encouraged to have a notebook and to gather insights from writers that they read or from speakers that they heard. So now that sounds really, really basic, but it's really exciting to see ways in which that practice led to a lot of fantastic creation. And we have many examples of writers and scientists and poets and creators who kept commonplace books, whether it's astronomers or Virginia Woolf or Lewis Carroll. I can share a link after the webinar of a number of websites that gather these commonplace books together. But it's something that it's something that's deceptively simple, I think, the practice of writing down favorite quotations or passages from models that you admire. But it is I think a powerful and effective model for how to get students into the kind of conversation with intellectual history that you want them to engage with. So my students were just working on a semester-long project where they had memorized a sonnet and then they began a research project on that sonnet. And basically I told them that what we're doing is commonplacing. So look at the facsimile, the photo reproduction of the image of the first publication of your poem, and then transcribe it, and then think about how the spelling and punctuation differs from today and why that matters. That was one of their commonplacing entries. And then they reviewed a number of scholars and saw what those scholars said about their poem. And then they listened to some recitations and considered how the pronunciation of their poem, the recitation of their poem, differed from those people that they heard online. And they looked for a source of Shakespeare, and they examined word history in the dictionary, and they looked at the frequency of keywords, and they looked at the translation of that sonnet in a different language. So in effect, what they were doing was they were harvesting all of these insights from a wide range of sources, gathering them in a spot in this commonplace book, and then eventually that leads to them synthesizing those and creating a research paper where they are engaging their voice with an ongoing conversation. So that for me is, again, the commonplacing looks like a somewhat mechanical exercise where you're just writing down quotations, but in effect, you end up having, I think, a remarkable way in which you start to enter the conversation. And by the end of the semester, I feel like my students are the equals of all of these major scholars because they've thought so broadly and imaginatively about how to read the single poem. So I've done the same thing I've had my students also commonplace in looking at a book called How to Write by Alistair Fowler. I know this is a small font on here, but I just kind of wanted to give you a sense of the range of work that they ended up doing. So this book by Fowler is called How to Write. It has I think 25 short chapters, again, very practical. And what we did in our class was, for every class session, they just chose a favorite sentence and analyzed it and described why they liked that sentence. And they did that every single class session. So at the end of the semester, they had built up a commonplace book of insights from this book. And I was really pleased because some students, I'm just finishing class this week, and some students spontaneously were saying, wow, this is really great. I'm going to continue to do this in my other classes. And most of these are not students who are going to major in English, but they found it productive and something that they want to continue doing in the rest of their time in college. So that can be a physical book. That can also just be a word processor document where you're building up favorite passages. And it really was the genesis of the book itself was commonplacing. It was, the book grew out of my teaching and assignments that I'd given my students over the years, where I had shared with them favorite quotations from a wide range of thinkers and writers. So in some ways, the book is a little tough to read at first, I think, because it's really stuffed with quotations. Andy, you can confirm that. Sometimes a single paragraph will have five different voices that are invoked in each paragraph. But the goal is to really kind of create a chorus or a large group conversation about aspects of thinking and aspects of creation. I don't know, does that make sense, Andy? Was that your impression as you were reading it? Or?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, I think the sort of ingredients here that really stand out for me are the facilitation of you, the educator, of our audience as educators, to help students make sense of why they're doing this. So it's not just a mechanical sort of, set of tasks or a checklist, but, it's the process of commonplacing, but it's also the reflecting on what that commonplacing allows you to achieve. And to me, that sounds like it would really lend well to the physical pen and paper or notebook. But I could also see technology, and I see a lot of our audience are chatting about the technologies they use to collaborate and annotate. Technology can allow for this as well. So, that commonplacing becomes, a skill set or a mindset that, now stretches 6 centuries because the technology can be modified.
Absolutely. And it's I obviously, I am a big fan of transcribing and cutting and pasting and using annotation technologies in my own work and in the classroom. I do think it is still worthwhile to do on occasion to go through the handwriting transcription. I even encourage my students when they're when they're examining a poem to write it out by hand. And it sounds simple, but it actually really works to pretend that they're composing the poem themselves, so that it is raw transcription at that point, but it is infused by thinking, or I'm asking them to kind of occupy the cognitive position of the person who made that poem and saying, okay, why would you say this word at this moment? And why would you then say this thing in the next line? And what kinds of questions are you raising by presenting the line in this order? So so it can range across a variety of platforms and a variety of media. Again, I'm not against digital technology. I just think it's also worthwhile thinking our way back to, what is valuable about doing something like writing out a line from sonnet number 1, from fairest creatures we desire increase, and then just stopping and asking yourself, why am I writing this? From fairest creatures we desire increase. Why wouldn't I write it, we desire increase from fairest creatures? Why would I start with that prepositional phrase? That's kind of odd. And how am I going to rhyme increase? I just set up increase. Now I have to find a rhyme for increase. I could say decrease, but actually Shakespeare says decease. So that's weird. And all of a sudden, a whole bunch of things start to become clear. You're occupying the position of the maker, rather than, again, feeling like this is alien to you or outside you.
Yeah, that sounds like a really critical point, and one to encourage, right? Is that if you maintain that sort of maker space or maker mentality, the closer you can get to your tools, the more likely you are to understand how to use them. So I appreciate you putting it that way.
Yeah, and I'm all for maker spaces. I just think that we need to praise and consider the work that we do in language arts and in history and in writing classes as being maker spaces as well. I think I don't want that to be only STEM fields. I think that we should feel very proud that the humanities classroom is a maker space, and that, again, as you were asking earlier, Andy, about how to get beyond students feeling like this is just mechanical, busy work of transcribing these quotations. It's very easy to point to many examples of great writers, great thinkers, great scientists who did exactly this mechanical thing, but then that allowed them to enter the conversation, as it were. If you take that as the conceit of how does intellectual history work, it's like a conversation that you come late to, and you try to figure out what's going on, and then eventually you start to contribute to that conversation, and you are a peer, you are an equal to that conversation. And that really is the goal for me for commonplacing, is initially to survey the field of how do people talk about this topic, and then eventually, hey, I'm an equal to this. I have something to say, and I'm not the first person to talk about this topic, and I won't be the last, but I'm part of an ongoing conversation. You probably have seen memes like this or websites like this, like Shakespeare invented 1,700 of our everyday words, and then you maybe have also seen websites that kind of snarkily reply, no, Shakespeare did not really invent 1,700 English words. Part of what's going on here is the fact that that number is derived from 19th century dictionaries that oversampled canonical, hypercanonical writers like Shakespeare and Chaucer and Milton. So in many cases, we've been able to antedate and find earlier examples of words that used to be claimed as words that Shakespeare might have invented, but in fact were in the air, or we just didn't have the prior attribution. But now that we know that it was actually written a decade earlier, before he first wrote that word down. Also, wonderful, massive digital databases of words printed in England before 1700 are now publicly available, and your students can search those. And it's often, I have a colleague who has that as an assignment in class: take a word that is claimed to have been invented by Shakespeare, and look at that database and do a keyword search and find out that it was actually not invented by him. Someone else came up with it 10 or 20 years earlier. But it's also, this claim about the inventing all those words partly relies on a too narrow vision of what invention means, or what it means to invent something. I think we might wrongly think of invention as something that comes from scratch, that you're making something from nothing. But there's a great word from the history of rhetoric called inventio, which really gives us two contemporary English words, inventory and invention. And the premise of inventio, or the premise of rhetorical invention, was that the first thing you need to do to make an argument or to make any piece of writing is to make an inventory of the stuff you know. And then that leads to the invention. The inventiveness is the rearranging of stuff. The inventiveness is not making up something from scratch. So again, this kind of connects to the commonplacing in the sense that your words, you're not the first person to have ever uttered your words, but you are the person who has rearranged them to make them fit for this particular occasion or this particular audience. So I love when we have words like that we can pair in that way, and you can see, oh, actually being inventive comes out of building up an inventory of prior reading and exposure to other thinkers. I've got a great example of this in action from Macbeth, which many of you probably recognize. So Macbeth he's just killed Duncan. He and Lady Macbeth have just killed Duncan. He's feeling conscience-stricken, and he asks, will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? So, of course, he's feeling guilty, so the answer is no. No, this my hand will rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine. Now, you're probably asking, unless you've read the play recently and you've looked at the notes, what on earth is incarnadine? Because it's not a word that is familiar with us today. And in fact, it was not familiar in Shakespeare's era. So the cool thing is in the play, he knows that he's kind of laid out this elaborate word, this amazing Latinate word, and that you as the audience or the reader probably won't recognize it. So he glosses it in the very next line. No, this my hand will rather than the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red. Incarnadine means turn something red. And then maybe your ears might perk up if you know Spanish or French or Latin, that it's partly related to carne or flesh, so something that's flesh colored or bloody. So we have this great example of him. We do think this is a word that he made up. If we look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, it is attributed to the play Macbeth. This my hand will rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red. Though comically, it seems like he didn't like the word because he only uses it once in all of his plays. This is a free public resource, open source Shakespeare. I can share the link later on, but it's basically a concordance, a full data set of all of the words from all of the plays and poems, which any of your students can search instantly, and you can find if something appears only once, or if it's a really frequent word, or maybe this is the only play in which it appears, or this is the only time it appears in the sonnet. So that's a great tool for kind of thinking your way into Shakespeare as a maker again. And when we talk about invention, we really need to think about inventing based on prior inventory. In this case, prior knowledge of the word incarnate or incarnation, or having to do with flesh in some manner. And did you want to jump in there? Any questions? You want me to follow up, or?
Yeah, no questions so far. No, it feels like you've got a good rhythm. And as always, I'll encourage our audience, if they have a formal question, to drop it into the Ask Professor Newstock tab. I'll be happy to bring it forward. But I think we're doing okay right now. And just as a time check, we've got about 35 minutes left.
Okay, that sounds good. So just like that word inventio gives us both the English inventory and invention, there's another fantastic Latin word, copia, that was at the heart of humanist pedagogy across Europe in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. And I think is still a wonderful tool to deploy in the classroom today. And I think it's been a fun and effective thing in my classes, and I know of other teachers who have played around with this in their classes as well. So copia gives us obviously it gives us the English word copy. So when you think about an exact copy or a Xerox copy, something that's supposed to be exactly like the thing that you're copying. But copia also gives us the word copious or copiousness, kind of a profusion of copying. Or if you think about the word cornucopia, we have there that sense of a horn of plenty, of something that's wonderfully excessive. So again, Erasmus, who is a Dutch humanist and theologian and translator and educator, but really helped found a number of brilliant pedagogical practices at the beginning of the 1500s, wrote a whole treatise on copia, talking about the copia of words, how you can say the same thing in different ways, how you can rephrase the same sentiment with a different set of words, how you can go on and rephrase the very thing that he's urging us to do. So in Erasmus's wonderful treatise De Copia, he does this playful exercise where he says, look, let's take one of the most banal, boring, everyday phrases you can imagine in 16th century culture. Your letter pleased me greatly. So today it would be your email made me happy, or thanks for the text, or something like that. So just an everyday phrase. That seems straightforward. That's an easy thing. You know, what's curious about that? That doesn't seem terribly sophisticated or worth any of our attention. But what Erasmus does is something pretty fascinating. He takes that example of that phrase and he says, let's just think through all the different ways we can say, your letter pleased me greatly. Your letter mightily pleased me. To a wonderful degree did your letter please me. Me exceedingly did your letter please. By your letter was I mightily pleased. So you can see sometimes he's rearranging the order of what's said in the sentence. Sometimes he's swapping out one different adverb for another adverb. Sometimes he's inverting the subject and the object. I was exceeding pleased by your letter. Your epistle exhilarated me intensely, and it kind of becomes comical. You can tell that he's having fun with it. I was intensely exhilarated by your epistle. Your brief note refreshed my spirits in no small measure. I was in no small measure refreshed in spirit by your grace's hand. From your affectionate letter, I received unbelievable pleasure. Your affectionate letter brought me unbelievable pleasure. Your pages engendered in me an unfamiliar delight. I conceived a wonderful delight from your pages. Your lines conveyed to me the greatest joy. The greatest joy, we had to kind of cram this on the slide here. The greatest joy was brought to me by your lines. And then he goes on for another 125 more variations. So this is obviously meant to be kind of ludicrous. Like who would spend that much time on coming up with, 140 different ways of saying your letter pleased me greatly. But the point is that if you want to be a compelling writer, you need to find ways to make your words fit the occasion. And sometimes that might mean finding slightly different words to say the same thing. So I've done this in class by asking my students to just rewrite the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence. And this is something that an exercise that I developed inspired by a fantastic book by political theorist Danielle Allen. I can't recommend this book highly enough. Danielle Allen was teaching in Chicago she was volunteering in a adult education program where for a whole semester in the evenings, students, many of whom had not graduated high school and none of whom had graduated from college, had the chance to just work with a University of Chicago political theorist and read through the Declaration together, which, as you know, is a short document, but she marvelously, in this book, which is an account of this teaching experience, unpacks the complexity and the sophistication of every single sentence of the Declaration. And so part of what I was doing with my students was asking them, okay, let's think of different ways we could rewrite that same sentence and what's gained and what's lost. And those of you that work with students with multiple language backgrounds, or you yourself have multiple languages, know that that's part of the wonderful dynamic of translation is what's gained and what's lost when you say it in this language and when you rephrase it in this language. But this is even in the same language. So if I write the sentence in a slightly different way, or if I use slightly different words, what is gained and what's lost? And I really do think that that's something that was at the heart of the copia method of the humanist pedagogy. Allen she's brilliant. She's written on the punctuation of the Declaration and differing punctuation in different versions of the drafts that we have. She looks at Thomas Jefferson's original rough draft of the Declaration, and then she just gives the Declaration a wonderful, slow reading. So one of the first chapters, takes that sentence and leans into that word course and says, okay, let's slow down and think, what do we mean when we say course? She looks it up in the dictionary. She has her students dig into the etymology of the word. She thinks about what it means to, what kinds of things do we talk about when we talk about coursing? Oh, well, a river courses. Well, what does that imply? That implies it has a certain forward motion, that it has the kind of momentum, but it can be changed with collective action and deliberation, and it can move in different directions. It can sweep things up with it. So I mean, that to me is just a brilliant example of copia, of kind of walking through all the intonations of why you would choose these particular words for this statement, and why it matters that you didn't choose other words. So that's been very effective for me. I think it's eye-opening. I think at first, that's like many of these exercises, at first it might seem like, why are we doing this? This is so obvious. But the more the students get into it, in my experience, the more eye-opening it's been, and they realize, like, wow, course is really weirdly the right word for all kinds of complicated reasons here. It wouldn't work to have a synonym. That the copia exercise forces them to recognize the value in that particular phrasing. There's another exercise that is kind of similar in terms of thinking of either imitating or saying the same thing in different ways. That's called double translation. And let me just kind of walk through exactly what that meant and then why it was so effective. So the education in the Shakespearean classroom would have been in Latin. It would not have been in English. So that seems on the surface like a kind of a paradox, that training in a foreign language would lead to fluency and facility within another language. But again, any of you who speak multiple languages recognize that kind of shifting across languages does force you to think harder about the way you articulate things in your first or second language. In fact, that Baldwin essay that I mentioned earlier has part of its narrative pivot. Baldwin describes his journey to France and his time in France as something that gave him greater clarity and perspective on the English language, because he was forced to think in French, and because he was forced to kind of work through thoughts in French in a way that he hadn't done before. So this exercise, double translation, was something that was advocated by Queen Elizabeth's tutor in a treatise called The Schoolmaster. This era was the great era of treatises and manifestos about education. It's clear that there was a lot of eagerness and ambition and anxiety about how to educate well. And Ascham's suggestion for this practice of double translation goes like this. He says, the child should take a book, and sitting in some place where no man shall prompt him, no teacher, by himself, let him translate into English his former lesson. Then, showing it to his master, let the master take from him his Latin book, and pausing an hour at the least, then let the child translate his own English into Latin again in another paper book. When the child bringeth it turned into Latin, the master must compare it with the original Latin, Cicero's book, and lie them both together. So that's a little awkward to read because it's in that kind of convoluted Elizabethan language. But let me just kind of walk through a chart that gives a visual analog to what he's recommending. So he's taking the language original, the student translates that into the second language, in this case Latin, into English. The English is kind of set aside for a moment, and then the English is translated back into Latin, and then the Latin is compared to the original Latin. So it's made this circuit of going from Latin to English and English to Latin, but then the point is supposed to be that ultimately you can compare the original Latin to the double translated Latin. Well, that's really tough, even if you've ever just kind of played around with Google and translated a phrase back and forth across two languages, you know that things very quickly get mangled. But you can see how going through that process would give you great facility, not only in the dual language facility, but also in imitating someone else's style. So if you're so good at imitating a particular author's voice that you could sound like them, this is another thing that seems like a mechanical practice, but actually if I can imitate her voice and his voice and their voice and her voice, eventually I gain such facility in sounding like others that I find the best way to sound like myself, that I find the style that's most appropriate to me, in part by recognizing how style works in other authors. So I think I've done that with I've asked students to translate a line from a play or a line from a poem into their first or second language, and then back again and see what's gained and what's lost. It can be eye-opening, and it can often be one of those moments where you look back on the original and you see something that you hadn't seen before, that you start to look at it and you recognize that I was just taking for granted the way this was phrased, but now that I've been forced to attempt to articulate it in another language, something has become clear to me in the process. And again, I think this works well with, I know it works well from my experience with students who are non-native speakers, because they're translating from their second or third language back into their first language, and then back again into their second or third language. And that can be a very powerful experience for them, going through that transit. That it doesn't have to be Latin and English, obviously. It can be any language that goes through this circuit. But it's a pretty fascinating experiment, and it's actually something that works even in English to English. There's a great example, if you know Benjamin Franklin's Autobiography. He was kind of forced by his brother in his teens to leave school and to work as an apprentice for his brother. So Franklin, to some degree, was self-educated, and one of his frustrations was that he didn't feel like he was a good writer. So one of the ways that he taught himself to be a better writer was he would take a copy of The Spectator, which was an early mid-18th century British periodical that he admired, and it was a good model of style, and he would imitate it. So he would this is directly from the Autobiography. I'll just quote here for a second. He said, "I took some of the papers, making short hints of the sentiment in each sentence. I laid them by a few days," and he puts aside The Spectator, and then, without looking at The Spectator, tried to complete the papers again by expressing each hinted sentiment at length and as fully as it had been expressed before in any suitable words that should come to mind. Then I compared my Spectator, his double translated version, with the original, and discovered some of my faults and corrected them. But that could be, again, this is not Shakespeare centric. This could be any model of writing that you think you want your students to imitate, so that they are able to kind of occupy that position of a maker, of a creator, and can also recognize stylistic features in the thing that they're reading. I think Andy was asking earlier about difficulties that I find students encountering in making the transition from secondary to post-secondary writing and thinking and analysis. I do sometimes feel like I struggle with my students to help get them away from a kind of checklist quality of looking for, structure, diction, tone, metaphor, simile, as if that's how you analyze writing, and you just kind of check all those boxes and then you're done. Whereas I think that if you help them work their way into recognizing elements of style as generative elements or as active elements of a writer, rather than as kind of arbitrary ornament from the outside, I think that often is a helpful way to help get them inside a writer's head. And the funny thing about Franklin, I'll just close with this. There are coders who recommend what they call the Benjamin Franklin method of programming, that they recommend exactly the same thing, which is find a program that you admire, read it, take notes on the roles, inputs and outputs, take notes on how the components interact, rewrite the program, compare your code with the original, and note where you can improve and study accordingly. So this is an emulative model that's not specific to Shakespeare or even specific to writing in any one language. It really is part of the practice of finding a model of some kind of human behavior that you like and admire, and then trying to reproduce it, and then going back to compare your imitation to the model as a way to help think your way into somebody else's creative mind, if you think of it that way. Andy, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and that's particularly this last example is a really fascinating application of the Franklin model to essentially computer science or CS process. I wonder too if you see and note that your students, when they engage with these kinds of activities, also learn that notion of sensible self-denial, that it takes a while. You have to slow things down and linger and close read in some cases, or use a pen with your hand that takes longer than typing it into a keyboard. Do you find that the slower pace is also a benefit?
Yes, I do think it's a benefit. I mean, the studies that I've seen about even the dynamics of note-taking on paper versus note-taking, transcribing on a keyboard seem to indicate that part of the virtue of handwriting, note-taking on paper relates to the slowing down, because it is possible as a kind of transcriptionist, as almost like a legal transcriptionist, to take down every single word. But in some ways, it seems like the effect of that dynamic is that you're short-circuiting the process of evaluating the things that you're transcribing. Whereas when you're taking notes by hand, you often are having to make summaries and kind of draw arrows and make shorthand symbols of what you heard the person saying, and that ends up productively helping you engage more with the thing that you're transcribing. I think it's the same for that dynamic of asking a student to transcribe a phrase by hand and ask them to pretend that they're making it as they're doing it. It's kind of the slowing process that you're talking about, Andy, is I think cognitively beneficial, because again, you're almost occupying the space of the creator. I know that there were, again, trying to think about analogs in different fields, the composers were encouraged to do the same thing with a musical composition that they admired, and to transcribe the notes that they saw, kind of asking themselves the same questions, like, why would I move from this note to this note, or why would I slow the pace down at this point, or why would this be a crescendo at this point? There's a number of examples that I bring up in the book of artists who attest to saying, this was really helpful for me to just do the raw imitation, which helped me figure out how the thing worked. Judd Apatow talks about transcribing old Saturday Night Live episodes just to try to get a feel for the timing by occupying that space. And then it allowed him to reflect upon, okay, what worked about that. I guess the one other analog that comes to mind is the kind of metaphor of going under the hood of an engine and trying to figure out, like, how does this thing work, rather than just kind of looking at it from the outside and feeling distant from it, but actually kind of getting your hands dirty and looking at how it's built, how it's created, how it functions, what doesn't work, what does work. Again, I guess I just keep on coming back to that. It's trying to occupy the space of the maker to help you think about yourself as a maker.
That's a great point. Thank you. Professor, I know you've got some additional slides that you've put together in case we had time. I think we have about 15 minutes, and you may, in fact, decide to move into another section to bring out one more example. But so if I'm asking this question and it was in your slides, you might just go to it, or we can just talk about it verbally. But I'm curious about your thoughts about recitation. We've talked about the translation, we talked about the invention, but that idea of memorizing or reciting or sharing that kind of insights. How does that work in the chapter that you wrote?
Sure. I mean, I think for the chapter on exercises, I begin with an analog from, again, physical sport, so I ran track in college and in high school, and our coaches would have us do all kinds of goofy warm-up exercises that were almost like everything except for running in a straight line. We would kind of run sideways scissor step. We would skip down the line. We would run backwards. We would hop, and it looks kind of absurd from the outside, but in a way, the point was to stretch our muscles so that when we went back to running in a straight line, we could do it that much better. So that's a truism from all kinds of athletic training about cross training, that the more you move different muscle parts, the better you're able to coordinate what you're doing when you come back to your home task. And I think it's the same for recitation. I've worked with a number of actors and directors who do exactly that with reciting a single line, that they will recite a line kind of absurdly quietly and almost to a whisper that you can't even hear. And then they'll do what's called loud speaking, and they'll kind of yell the line, and then they'll do the line in a questioning way with an upswing at the end, and then they will do the line in a very angry voice. And in a way, by trying the full range of articulation, they're able to true themselves and kind of work their way back into, like, where's the space where this thing works the best. So I guess it's almost like a version of verbal copia, where you're saying the same thing but you're delivering it differently. And we know that that's true from musical performance as well, where you're trying to figure out, what's the right tempo and what's the right emphasis here. But again, when I've had my students memorize a poem, I don't want them to do it mechanically. I want that memorization to be suffused with thinking. Like, why are you slowing down here? What is it about the way this line works that it makes sense to slow down? Or why should you continue beyond the end of the line here? Why is that sentence incomplete if you pause at the end of the line? So again, I guess it feels like it's a common thing. I keep on saying this, but it is at the heart of the book, that many of these things that look like they're pretty basic or maybe even remedial actually can be put to some wonderfully subtle and creative and complex effects when you're applying them with the end in mind of being more creative and of engaging more intimately with the things that you're reading.
Yeah, and I understand. I don't think that you've been saying this bashfully, but I do understand the impulse to say, this seems kind of basic and elementary. But I think Teresa's point in the audience chat right now is a good one, which is, as teachers, we often kind of forget. We forget to employ and invite students to engage in this way, partly because of the urgency of the day, partly because of the pressures of teaching in virtual learning now, partly because sometimes we just forget. But this has really been a great reminder of how students benefit from these kinds of practices. And as humans, how it speaks to the way we think and learn, and how we attach ourselves, engage ourselves with what we're learning.
Yeah, I think I like that, and I think I guess as long as whatever you're doing is an occasion for thought, and you're modeling that thought in yourself, and you're pausing in relationship to the thing that you're doing with your students, I think that really can help animate whatever you're doing. But I also do understand the pressures of time, and that different online fora and media are not as conducive to these kinds of dynamics as being in person can be. So I've suffered through a year and a half or a semester and a half of online teaching myself, so I know how difficult this is to make anything feel alive and feel animated when you're all staring at a blank screen all day long.
And having said that, without returning ourselves too much or focusing too much on the fact that we're largely teaching and learning in a virtual format, including this webinar, by the way, I do wonder if Maureen has asked if you use any annotation technologies, or is there anything that you could recommend to support the kind of approaches that you've been talking about tonight in a hybrid or a socially distanced format? Do you use any tech tools that allow you to do this?
I mean, I'm not terribly sophisticated about this, so I'm the wrong person to ask about distance tech tools for annotation, collective annotation. Mine have been more kind of basic in terms of asking students to create a collective Google Doc and to mutually comment upon whatever they're working on. I like the old-fashioned being in the room and using a whiteboard and having us mark things up together, or using an overhead projector where you're marking up the thought as it's happening. I guess one thing that I don't love, among the many things I don't love about PowerPoint, is the way in which it feels like you're presenting things that are already determined. And the more you can create versions of the equivalent of that whiteboard, or the equivalent of your thinking and process, the more helpful I think it can be, because again, you're staging or you're modeling your own your own thinking for them rather than presenting it as a completed thing or as a done thing. I have a couple of friends who are teachers who do live grading with their students, and I'm kind of terrified at the prospect, but I also really admire it, and they love it, and it's worked well for them. It's time consuming in terms of setting up the appointments to meet with the students, but their workaround is that what they end up doing is they're not actually grading the paper before they meet with the student. They're looking at the paper with the student for the first time, and they're saying, okay, this is what I see, what's going on in this first sentence here, and this works really well. This doesn't work really well. I'm a little puzzled here. Now I'm frustrated and confused by what you're doing, but I see what you're doing there. And in effect, at least they've told me that they take the same amount of time that they would have taken to marking the paper, but it's live for the student, so the student is seeing it happen, and the student's actually, I'm told, I've not done it, appreciating in some ways the labor that goes into the marking rather than, I think we're all frustrated as teachers when we put a lot of time into responding to student work and we don't always feel like all the students read the comments that we write. So that's a way to kind of make it present. The reason I've been hesitant is that it seems like it could also be very delicate and awkward and difficult if it goes the wrong way. But all the reports I've heard is that it's actually enjoyable and that the students really appreciate it. But that's a version of staging live thinking.
Right. Yeah, that's a fantastic point. Scott, at the beginning, you walked us through the chapters of your book, 16, 17 maybe. What did you leave out? What were some of the processes that didn't make the cut that you still feel are important to maybe note in thinking like this?
I tried to cram everything I could in there. I had a friend say it's kind of an accordion-like book, like it expands and contracts. So it is a short book. It's only about 150 pages long, maybe 40,000 words long, but it is because there's a lot of quotations crammed in there, and there's a lot of digressive footnotes, and there's suggestions for further reading. I did feel like I said pretty much all that I wanted to say. I have tons more examples of everything that I said. I had, countless. My commonplace files are enormous, but I really tried to boil it down to the things that seemed most essential to me. So I didn't really feel like there's anything I wasn't able to say that mattered to me. And I'm really enormously grateful to the publisher because they spent a lot of time formatting the book so that it looks as beautiful as it does. It's really a carefully crafted book. It's all credit to the editors and designers that they spent as much time on it as they did. I think it sits well in the hand, and the chapters are brief, but they're I think dense in a helpful way. I think you can pick one up and read it in 10 minutes, but it also can lead your thought in other directions. So I really love that about the book.
Yeah, and I suspect this is not the first time you've shared this with a broad and wide audience. What have been some of the reactions from educators, from colleagues, from others in the profession? What kind of reaction have you gotten?
Well, I think, I guess there's two kinds of reactions. One that I think I anticipated, which was, people who have similar training to what I have, I think do teaching like this already, that they do present Shakespeare as a maker. They do try to think their way into pedagogical practices that help their students open up the reading. So I was in some ways nervous about that audience because, my book is not really a scholarly book. It's meant to be a book for a more general reader. And I take hundreds of shortcuts along the way. And that made me concerned that a peer, another Shakespeare professor, would look at it and be dismissive. But in fact, I think most of them have been appreciative in ways that I'm really grateful for, because I think they know the shortcuts that I've taken, but they still recognize that it was worth making those leaps in order to make the argument. And then separately, I think, I've had some readers that have been more like Baldwin, where there maybe was some initial skepticism, like, well, why would I want to think like Shakespeare? What's the point? I think once they got past the till and got into the book, found that it's a book that's not meant to read that figure. It's a book that's meant to celebrate a lot of different wonderful artists and writers, and to focus on many fantastic aspects about education and creation that are not time bound, but are still alive and very vibrant today. So that to me has been really gratifying, hearing maybe more skeptical readers feeling like they found something that connected with them in the book.
I'm glad to hear that. And it doesn't surprise me really, because again, it is accessible regardless of what you teach or even how, what level you might teach. Of the chapters that you shared with us, the 16 that you annotated for us briefly, which one of those seemed to get the best response then? The whole book gets a good, strong response, but which one of those really seems to resonate with folks?
I don't know. It's funny. I think I actually like that there's not been a single one that stood out. A number of people have mentioned various chapters, but I think variable enough that, they're not meant to be the last word on any topic. They're more like a series of meditations that I hope can inspire further thought. So, I'm just looking over the table of contents, and I think I've had nice responses to all of them, and there's not really one that's jumped out as being more consistently preferred than the others. I mean, once I read the Baldwin essay, I knew I wanted to end the book with that, and so that chapter I think means the most to me, the final chapter. And I carefully, I wanted the topic to be the final chapter about the kind of freedom that this kind of education makes available. And I can't praise the Baldwin essay highly enough. So that in some ways that was the chapter I knew exactly where that chapter needed to be and what I wanted in it. The other chapters were more of a struggle in terms of thinking about the order in which they would be presented and what would go in one and go in another. A lot of the chapters kind of revise and revisit material from other chapters. So I still don't know that I got the order right, but I do feel like I did what I wanted to do in terms of conveying these thought-provoking short little essays across a variety of topics.
Scott, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. What you've done, I think, is really meet the goals of webinars like this, which is experts and authority and scholars who have really spent a lot of time thinking through these complicated kinds of issues, reducing them and sharing them for a broader audience. And now our audience, our participants, can take these ideas and implement them in their classrooms. So you've really pollinated quite a few classrooms tonight, and I want to thank you for that time. I see you've put some contact information on the screen. I don't think that's idly. Would you like to share any details about these?
No, I would love to be in touch with anyone. Any questions at all, or if there's anything I mentioned you'd like clarification or other websites or suggestions. I love being in touch with teachers all the time. So I'm eager to hear from people. This is the second link is to my website about the book, but the link that Shakespeare at Rhodes research resources. There I've gathered about 100 databases and resources online, most of which are free, that are related to Shakespeare's era and to his works, as well as to works of his contemporaries, dictionaries, databases, all kinds of resources are gathered there. I also want to plug the Folger Shakespeare Library, which has a wonderful set of free public resources. You can find downloadable versions of every play that you can edit in a document, or there are also photo facsimiles of all of the original publications that you can view and you can use in your classroom. That's really a remarkable set of resources there. And then I mentioned a couple of times the concordance, the open source Shakespeare was developed by the person who's actually now the digital librarian at the Folger Shakespeare Library, but it's a free open resource where right now you can go and you can click in any word and you can see how frequently or infrequently it appears, and that often makes a pattern visible that you hadn't recognized at first. So that's another great resource. I guess the last one I would mention that I failed to put on here is the MIT has a website that is an archive of global performances of Shakespeare in dozens of different languages and different performance traditions. So that's a fantastic resource if you're looking for video clips of plays in English as well as in the full span of languages across the globe.